In the heart of Melbourne CBD, on a summer day in 1921, a 12-year-old girl vanished while running an everyday errand. Her lifeless body was found the next morning in a grim laneway behind Little Collins Street. The city was stunned. Newspapers screamed for justice. Police scrambled. Then came the reward money, and with it, a flood of shady witnesses and dubious claims. Within weeks, Colin Campbell Ross, a young wine bar owner, was arrested, tried, and hanged, despite flimsy evidence and his desperate insistence that he was innocent. It would take more than 80 years, and the rise of DNA science, to finally prove the unthinkable, that the real killer walked free, and an innocent man was hanged. This is the story of a crime that shocked a city, and an injustice that haunted a nation. It was just after 6 a.m. on Saturday, the 31st of December, 1921, when Henry David Errington, a bottle gatherer, made a horrifying discovery in a narrow Melbourne laneway known as Gun Alley. There, lying face up with her legs folded awkwardly beneath her, was the lifeless body of a young girl. Her auburn hair fanned across the cold granite pitches, and her position suggested she hadn't been dumped, but carefully placed. Shocked, Errington ran straight to Watkins and Company Butchers on Burke Street and called the police. Senior Constable Saltz was first on the scene. What began as a routine morning for Errington had turned into the discovery of a crime that would stain the pages of Australian history for decades to come. There were bruises on her neck and lower body, grim signs of violence. An autopsy by government pathologist Dr. C. H. Mollison later confirmed the unthinkable. The child had been strangled. With no clothes on the body and no immediate identification, police were left grasping for leads. Detectives Piggott and Ashton, along with Constables Harper and Portingale, were assigned the case, but they faced a wall of silence. Who was this girl, and where had she come from? Then, a faint glimmer. A report at Russell Street Police Station mentioned a missing schoolgirl last seen in a navy blue tunic, white blouse, and Panama hat. It was a long shot, until someone noted the missing child had striking red hair. The victim in Gun Alley did too. It was enough to summon the family. When her uncle arrived at the morgue, the awful truth was confirmed. The dead girl was 12-year-old Alma Tirtschke. 12-year-old Nell Alma Tirtschke, known simply as Alma, had already known more loss than most. After her mother died, during a voyage from Rhodesia to Melbourne 7 years earlier, Alma and her younger sister Viola had been living with their grandmother, Elizabeth Tirtschke, on Jolimont Road. Their father, Charles Tirtschke, a builder in Maffra, was preparing to bring Alma home to live with him in just a few days. But that reunion would never happen. On Friday, the 30th of December, 1921, at 12:30 p.m., Alma was sent on a simple errand, one she had done before. She was to collect a parcel of meat from Bennett and Woolcock, a butcher's shop on Swanston Street, then drop it off at her aunt's place on Collins Street, before returning home. Alma knew the city well, and was given tram fare for the journey. She made it to the butcher's, that much was confirmed. But she never reached her aunt's house. As evening fell and Alma failed to return, her worried relatives contacted police. A young girl had vanished in broad daylight in the centre of Melbourne. The detectives have been busy in their search for the murderer of the little girl. It has been decided by the ministry to grant a full pardon to an accomplice, who will give information which will lead to the arrest and conviction of the murderer or murderers, and to increase the amount of the reward from initially declared £250 to £1,000. In addition to this, the Herald newspaper declared a reward of £250. Within a day or two of the discovery of the body, practically every house, as well as every room, bordering Little Collins Street between Russell Street and Spring Street, has been searched. Dozens of letters, some of which offer absurd theories, are daily received at the detective office. The body of the little girl was buried at Brighton Cemetery, only her relatives attending the funeral. Then, on the afternoon of January 12, 1922, police made their move. A young man named Colin Campbell Ross was arrested and charged with the willful murder of Alma Tirtschke. Ross had until recently been the licensee of a small wine saloon tucked away in the Eastern Arcade, not far from where Alma was last seen. The public, hungry for justice, now had a name. But behind the scenes, doubts were already forming. Ross swore he was innocent, and in time, the case against him would begin to unravel in ways no one imagined. To add intrigue to the murder, exactly 1 month after Alma's murder, her father was found dead at Mafra, with bullet wounds in his side of neck. He was on a hunting expedition with his nephew. But the police did not suspect foul play and held the opinion that shooting was accidental. The trial began on the 20th of February, 1922, and the prosecution leaned heavily on questionable witnesses. Among them was John Harding, a convicted perjurer and prison inmate, who claimed Ross had confessed to the murder while in custody. Others, including Ross's former employee and barmaid Ivy Matthews, sex worker Olive Maddock, and fortune teller Julia Gibson, known as Madame Gurkha, also alleged that Ross had confessed to them. The prosecution argued that Alma had willingly entered Ross's saloon, spent hours drinking wine, and was later raped and murdered, a claim entirely unsupported by direct evidence. Then came a string of damaging witness claims. Ivy Matthews, a former employee of Ross, told the court she had seen Alma inside the cafe. She said she once asked Ross, "Why did you do it?" and claimed he didn't deny it. Another witness, Olive Maddock, said she saw Alma in the cafe too, and that Ross later called the girl a cheeky little devil. But the most damning statement came from John Harding, an inmate at Melbourne jail. Harding claimed Ross had confessed to giving Alma sweet wine, choking her with his hands, and tearing up her clothes before scattering them along Footscray Road. Shortly after, police said they found torn strips of clothing. Alma's aunt was asked to examine them, and she said one piece looked familiar. The two witnesses, Ivy Matthews and the fortune teller Julia Gibson, were later considered by many to be unreliable, both having had a motive to lie. The saloon had recently sacked Matthews from her position as a barmaid, and Gibson was boarding with Matthews at the time. They both received part of the £1,000 reward for information. Despite the lack of hard evidence, no eyewitness to the crime, and serious doubts, the case was moving rapidly toward only one conclusion. Frank Lane Upton, a labourer, was called to testify. He claimed that on the night of the murder, he walked into Ross's wine cafe and overheard a woman's voice saying, "Oh my God, darling, how are we going to get rid of her?" He also said he saw Ross carrying a towel with red stains on it, and that the wine bottle Ross handed him had blood on it. Then came the so-called forensic proof. Strands of hair taken from Alma before her funeral were compared to hairs found on Ross's blanket. The government analyst, Charles Price, initially said the hairs were different in color and thickness, but eventually reversed himself, declaring they came from one and the same person. Despite the inconsistencies in his testimony, the court accepted his conclusion without question. Ross's lawyer, Thomas Brennan, pushed for a second forensic opinion, but the judge refused. The jury returned a guilty verdict, and Ross was sentenced to death by hanging. Despite Brennan's firm belief in his client's innocence, public opinion was firmly against Ross. When news of the sentence broke, crowds actually celebrated. Yet, Ross proclaimed his innocence right to the end. It was reported that his voice tremored at the time and he said, "If I'm hanged an innocent man. My life has been sworn away by desperate people." But Colin Ross wasn't entirely without a troubled past. 2 years before Alma's murder, he threatened a woman named Lily Mae Brown after she rejected his marriage proposal. When she refused him, he pulled a revolver and followed her onto a tram, continuing to threaten her until she agreed to meet him later. She went to the police instead. Ross was arrested and given a suspended sentence for threatening behavior and illegally carrying a firearm. Ross also found himself entangled in a violent incident at his own saloon just months before Alma's murder. In October 1921, a drunk customer, was robbed and shot in the lavatory behind the premises. Though the injury wasn't serious, an investigation pointed to a disturbing scheme. A young English traveller, Frank Walsh, later claimed that Ross had encouraged him to carry out the robbery, with the plan to split the proceeds. Both men were arrested and charged with armed robbery. Walsh was sentenced to 6 months hard labour, but Ross was ultimately acquitted. Still, the episode left a stain on his reputation, and raised further doubts about the company he kept and the decisions he made. It is believed that the large reward on offer may have influenced the emergence of several witnesses, who came forward with claims against Ross. Ivy Matthews received £350 of the government's £1,000 reward money, and £87 from the £250 offered by the Herald. Madame Gurkha, who ran a shop near Ross's and disapproved of his bar, also claimed Ross had confessed to her, earning herself £25. Ross's cellmate after his arrest, convicted criminal and perjurer John Harding, testified that Ross had confessed to him in prison and received £200. Prostitute Olive Maddock claimed she saw Alma having a drink in Ross's bar on the afternoon of the murder, and pocketed £170. In total, more than a dozen witnesses lined up to claim a share of the £1,250 in reward money, the equivalent of well over $100,000 today. Ross's lawyer Thomas Brennan was convinced of his client's innocence, fought to appeal the case, even trying to take it to the Privy Council in London, but every request was denied. The judge insisted Ross's guilt had been proven beyond doubt. On the night before his execution, Ross received an anonymous letter. The writer claimed responsibility for Alma's murder, expressed guilt, but said he couldn't confess publicly for fear of hurting his family. Brennan later said he believed the letter was genuine, a final, haunting clue that the wrong man was about to die. Thanks to the testimony of a string of so-called witnesses who received hefty rewards, and one piece of now discredited physical evidence, Ross was found guilty and was executed on the 24th of April, 1922 at Melbourne jail. Colin Ross's lawyer, Thomas Brennan, never stopped fighting for his client's innocence. He later wrote a book, The Gun Alley Tragedy, exposing the contradictions in the Crown's case. Brennan argued that no man in Victoria, or anywhere in the British Empire, had ever been convicted on such confused and conflicting testimony. The jury, he believed, was swayed by the horror of the crime and judged Ross before hearing the evidence. Ross admitted seeing the girl outside his bar, but he had a solid alibi for the time she disappeared. The so-called confession to Ivy Matthews made no sense. She and Ross had been bitter enemies. Yet she claimed he suddenly called her Ive and confessed to murder, then stayed silent for 3 weeks. She later claimed conscience made her speak, but left court with over £400 in reward money. Matthews lived with Madame Gurkha, another Ross critic who also got a payout. Then came Olive Maddox, a sex worker, who said she saw Alma in a back room, but also waited weeks to speak up, right after the reward was raised. And finally, Harding, a convicted liar, claimed Ross confessed in jail, describing impossible details and using words Ross would never have used. 3 flawed witnesses. 3 reward payments. 1 man hanged. Decades passed, until in 1993, researcher Kevin Morgan began investigating the case. He uncovered ignored evidence, including witnesses who placed Ross in his saloon during the time of the murder, and details of flawed testimony from those who helped convict him. In 1998, Morgan succeeded in having the original hair samples retested using modern DNA techniques. The result was clear: the hairs did not come from Alma Tirtschke. The key evidence used to hang Ross was false. In 2008, over 80 years after his execution, Colin Campbell Ross was officially pardoned. It was the first posthumous pardon for a judicial execution in Australian history. Even Alma's own family later admitted they always believed the wrong man was hanged. As a result, an appeal for mercy was made to Victoria's Chief Justice in 2006, and on the 27th of May, 2008 the Governor of Victoria pardoned Ross, in what is believed to be an Australian legal first. Meanwhile, the true identity of Alma Tirtschke's killer remains a mystery.